My name is Frank Delaney, and I am 78 years old. 3 weeks ago, my son Michael was hosting a barbecue for a group of his college friends, and I stopped by briefly to drop off a cooler he'd borrowed. As I was leaving, I heard him through the open kitchen window, laughing with his buddies, saying, "Yeah, that's just my dad. He's retired now. Kind of a nobody these days. Spends his time puttering around in the garage." His friends laughed along. What Michael didn't know, what he had genuinely never once asked me about in any real detail, was that at that exact moment, sitting on my kitchen counter at home, was a phone that 3 sitting state governors had personally called within the past 2 months, each one asking for my read on a policy decision that would affect millions of people. If you've ever had your life's work reduced to a punchline by someone who never thought to ask what you actually did, stay with me. Because this story isn't about proving my son wrong, it's about the strange, quiet gap that can grow between what a father actually did with his life and what his own children think he did, simply because nobody ever sat down and had the conversation. I need to tell you who I was before I tell you about that afternoon at the barbecue, because otherwise the ending won't land the way it should. I grew up outside Albany, New York, the son of a union electrician and a homemaker who ran our household with the precision of a small business. I studied political science at a state school, worked my way through with part-time jobs, and found, almost by accident, that I had a genuine talent for something most people find tedious beyond words: understanding how legislation actually gets written, how competing interests get balanced into something that can pass a state house, and how policy on paper translates, or fails to translate, into results in people's actual lives. I spent the first 15 years of my career as a legislative aide and then a senior policy advisor for 2 different state senators, learning the machinery of government from the inside in a way that most people never get exposed to. Somewhere in my late 30s, I transitioned into independent policy consulting, working primarily on issues related to infrastructure funding, rural healthcare access, and education funding formulas. Unglamorous, deeply technical subjects that rarely make headlines, but that determine, in very concrete terms, whether a small town's hospital stays open or whether a rural school district can afford new textbooks. Over the following 4 decades, I built a reputation, quietly, among a certain circle of people who mattered for this kind of work, as someone whose analysis you could trust completely, someone who told you the hard truth about a policy's likely consequences rather than just the version that made a particular political faction happy. I never sought public attention. 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 My work happened in conference rooms, over phone calls, in memos that went to people who made decisions, not to the general public. That kind of career doesn't generate applause. It generates something quieter and, in its own way, more durable. A small, trusted network of people who call you specifically because they know you'll tell them the truth. I met my wife, Helen, when I was 31, at a conference on rural infrastructure funding, of all places. She was a public health researcher, sharp and unafraid to challenge a room full of policy people twice her seniority, and we spent that entire conference arguing productively about the intersection of our 2 fields, which turned out to be an excellent foundation for 42 years of marriage. Helen had a gift I never quite mastered myself. She could take the driest, most technical policy concept and explain it to anyone, at any dinner party, in a way that made them lean in rather than glaze over. I used to tell her she should have been the one doing the consulting work, and I should have stayed home managing the household, and she'd laugh and remind me that someone in the family needed to actually be good at explaining what we did for a living. We had 1 son, Michael, born when I was 38, relatively late by the standards of our families, which meant Michael grew up with a father who was already deeply established in a demanding, all-consuming career by the time he was old enough to form real memories of me. I traveled frequently during his childhood, testimony before committees, working sessions in state capitals several hours from home, late nights reviewing draft legislation that needed a response by morning. Helen held our household together during those years with a competence I never fully appreciated until much later, and she made sure Michael never felt the absence of a father the way he might have with a less deliberate mother managing the gaps. Helen passed 5 years ago, a sudden cardiac event that gave us no warning and no chance to prepare. Since then, I've lived alone in the same house we bought when Michael was in elementary school, a comfortable but modest place outside of Albany, close enough that I see Michael regularly, close enough that I could, if I wanted, walk to several of the state offices where I've spent decades of my working life. The quiet of that house, in the years since Helen died, has taken some getting used to. She was the one who filled our home with conversation, who translated my long silences into something warmer for whoever happened to be visiting, and without her, I've had to learn how to be a more forthcoming person on my own, a lesson that, as you'll see, I still had a great deal further to go on than I realized. I want to be honest about something. I never made a habit of talking about my work in detail at home, even when Michael was growing up. Partly this was simple professional discretion. A great deal of what I did involved confidential conversations that weren't mine to share casually at the dinner table. But partly, if I'm being fully honest with myself, it was also a kind of quiet modesty that Helen used to gently tease me about. "You could at least let the boy know his father is actually somebody important, Frank," she'd say, only half joking, after I'd deflect some dinner party question about my work with a vague, self-deprecating answer rather than the more accurate description of what I actually did. Michael grew up as a result with a fairly thin understanding of what his father actually did for a living. He knew I worked in government stuff, as he put it as a teenager, and later, as an adult, he understood I did some kind of consulting. He never expressed much curiosity about the specifics, and I never volunteered them, and over the decades, that mutual lack of curiosity calcified into something like an unspoken agreement that my career simply wasn't a topic either of us needed to explore in any depth. Michael became a marketing manager for a mid-sized tech company, a career I've always been genuinely proud of, even though it occupies a very different world than mine ever did. He's good at his job, well-liked by his colleagues, the kind of easy, sociable person who makes friends effortlessly, which was never exactly my strong suit. He married his college sweetheart Danielle about 6 years ago, and they don't have children yet, though I know they've talked about it. I retired officially about 4 years ago, stepping back from the day-to-day consulting work that had defined my career for 4 decades. What Michael, and frankly most people outside a fairly small professional circle, didn't understand was that retirement, in my particular field, doesn't mean what it means in most careers. I stopped taking new formal consulting contracts. I stopped billing hours, but the relationships I'd built over 40 years, the reputation for careful, honest analysis that I'd earned across multiple gubernatorial administrations didn't simply switch off the day I filed my retirement paperwork. If anything, once I was no longer formally affiliated with any single client or firm, several people who valued my perspective began reaching out even more directly, precisely because they knew my advice now came with zero commercial motive attached to it whatsoever. Over the past several years, I've maintained ongoing, informal advisory relationships with 3 sitting state governors. I won't name them specifically here, both out of respect for the informal nature of those relationships and because that's simply not information that's mine to broadcast. But I can tell you these are governors across 3 different states, representing different political parties, each of whom reached out to me independently over the years, initially through mutual professional contacts, because they'd heard about my reputation for straight, nonpartisan policy analysis on infrastructure and rural healthcare issues specifically. These aren't ceremonial relationships. When a governor's office is trying to understand the likely on-the-ground impact of a proposed rural hospital funding formula, or trying to model how a particular infrastructure bill will actually play out in practice rather than in theory, I'm one of a small handful of people they call, specifically because I have 4 decades of pattern recognition about how these policies actually unfold once they leave the State House and meet reality. In just the 2 months before that barbecue, I'd had substantive phone calls with 2 of those 3 governors' offices and a longer working session with the 3rd, regarding a piece of rural healthcare legislation that was moving through that state's legislature. None of this, I should be clear, has ever made me wealthy or famous. I live modestly. My name doesn't appear in press releases. The work itself is the reward, along with the quiet satisfaction of knowing that a piece of advice I gave might have helped keep a rural hospital's doors open somewhere, or improved a funding formula that would actually reach the school districts that needed it most. It's not the kind of career that produces stories you'd naturally tell at a barbecue, which is perhaps part of why Michael never fully understood the shape of it. 3 weeks ago, on a warm Saturday afternoon, I drove over to Michael's house to return a cooler he'd borrowed for a camping trip the previous month. I hadn't planned to stay. He was hosting a barbecue for several of his college friends who were in town for a wedding, a group I recognized vaguely from photographs over the years but didn't know particularly well myself. I figured I'd simply drop the cooler at the door and head home, not wanting to intrude on what was clearly a younger crowd's gathering, the kind of relaxed Saturday afternoon that doesn't really have room for an aging father lingering at the edges of it. As I approached the side door near the kitchen, cooler in hand, I could hear music playing faintly from a speaker somewhere in the backyard, the low hum of maybe 8 or 10 people talking and laughing over the sound of something sizzling on the grill. I heard voices through the open kitchen window. Michael's voice, easy and relaxed, clearly mid-conversation with a group of his friends, the kind of loose, joking tone people use when they're comfortable and a few beers into an afternoon. The tone of a man who has no idea anyone outside that circle is listening. "Hey, is that your dad's car in the driveway?" one of his friends asked, apparently having glimpsed my sedan through the front window. "Yeah, that's just my dad," Michael said, and I could hear the casual dismissiveness in his voice, even before I fully processed the words. "He's retired now. Kind of a nobody these days, honestly. Spends most of his time puttering around in the garage, doing yard work, that kind of thing, old guy stuff." A few of his friends laughed, not unkindly, just the easy laugh of people amused by an affectionate, if careless, description of someone else's father, the kind of laugh that doesn't carry malice, but doesn't carry much thought behind it either. "What'd he do before he retired?" another voice asked, sounding only mildly curious, the way you'd ask about a stranger's job, rather than something that actually mattered to the conversation. "Honestly, I don't even really know the specifics," Michael said, and I heard something almost sheepish in his tone now, like he was realizing, even as he said it, how strange that admission sounded, standing in his own kitchen, describing his own father to people he'd known for over a decade. Some kind of government consulting thing. Boring policy stuff, I think. He never really talked about it much. I stood there on the side porch for a long moment, cooler still in my hands, the late afternoon sun warm on my shoulders, feeling something complicated rise in my chest. Not anger exactly. Something closer to a strange, quiet grief. The recognition that 39 years old, my son genuinely did not know in any concrete detail what his own father had spent 40 years of his life doing, or what that work still meant to people who mattered a great deal in 3 different state capitals, and that he had just described that entire unexplored life to a group of near strangers as old guy stuff. I set the cooler down quietly by the door, didn't knock, and drove home. I want to be honest about what I felt during that drive. My first instinct was not entirely generous. Part of me wanted to march back over there, interrupt the barbecue, and simply announce, plainly, exactly who I was and exactly what puttering around in the garage actually shared space with in my daily life. But I've spent 4 decades learning that reactive decisions rarely produce the outcomes you actually want, and I made myself sit with the feeling instead of acting on it immediately. That evening, sitting alone in my kitchen, I thought about Helen and what she would have said. I could practically hear her voice. "Frank, this is exactly what I used to warn you about. You can't expect people to understand something you've never bothered to explain to them." She would have been right, and I knew it, sitting there. I had built, over 4 decades, a habit of quiet, professional discretion that had served me well in my career but had, somewhere along the way, calcified into something closer to unnecessary secrecy within my own family. Michael wasn't wrong to have a thin understanding of my career. I had never given him the material to build a fuller one. I didn't call Michael that night. I let it sit for several days, thinking carefully about how I wanted to approach it. I didn't want this to become an accusation, a gotcha moment, where I made him feel foolish for something that was, in significant part, a gap I myself had created through decades of quiet reticence. The following week, I called Michael and asked if he'd come over for dinner, just the two of us. He agreed, a little surprised, since our visits usually happened at his place rather than mine, and usually involved Danielle and a broader group rather than a quiet one-on-one dinner. Over dinner, I asked him, directly but gently, what he actually understood about my career. He gave me roughly the same answer I'd overheard through the kitchen window, vague references to government consulting and boring policy stuff, delivered with a slightly embarrassed shrug, as though he recognized, even as he said it, how little substance was actually behind those words. "Michael," I said, "I heard what you told your friends at the barbecue last week, about me being a nobody, spending my time puttering in the garage." His face went red immediately. "Dad, I didn't mean it like that. I was just—" "I know you didn't mean it maliciously," I said. "That's actually the more troubling part, if I'm honest. You weren't being cruel. You were being accurate, based on the information you actually had. And that's on me, Michael, not you. I've spent 4 decades not fully explaining to you what I actually did with my working life, and I think, somewhere along the way, that silence taught you that there wasn't much worth explaining." I spent the next 2 hours doing something I had genuinely never done before in any comprehensive way. I walked Michael through my actual career, in real detail, for the first time in his adult life. I told him about my early years as a legislative aide, 24 years old and terrified in a room full of people twice my age, learning how a bill actually moves from an idea scrawled on a legal pad to language that survives committee, floor votes, and conference negotiations without losing its essential purpose along the way. I told him about the specific mechanics of how infrastructure funding formulas actually get negotiated, the unglamorous, granular work of figuring out how a dollar allocated in a state capital actually translates into a road repaved or a bridge inspected in a county most legislators have never personally visited. I told him about the rural hospital that had stayed open, as far as I could determine, in part because of a funding mechanism I'd helped design 15 years earlier, a small county hospital in a district I'd never lived in or had any personal connection to, except that the funding formula I'd helped structure happened to account for exactly the kind of low-population, high-need situation that hospital represented. I told him I still think about that hospital sometimes, wondering how many people in that county had a doctor to see because of a formula most of them would never know existed, let alone know who'd helped shape it. I told him, carefully, about the 3 governors, without naming them specifically, about the calls I'd fielded in just the past 2 months, about the ongoing weight and responsibility that retirement, in my particular field, simply didn't erase. I explained how these relationships had built slowly over decades, one project at a time, one piece of honest analysis at a time, until eventually a handful of people in genuinely consequential positions had learned they could call me with a hard question and get a straight answer, rather than a politically convenient one. Michael sat mostly in silence through much of it, occasionally asking a genuine, curious question, the kind of question that told me he was actually absorbing this for the first time as real information rather than background noise. At one point he asked me directly, "Dad, why didn't you ever tell me any of this before? Not even the broad strokes." I feel like I've been living next to a stranger my whole life in some ways. "I think," I said slowly, "I got used to a kind of professional discretion that made sense in my working life, and I never fully separated it from how I talk to my own family. Confidentiality is a real thing in my field, Michael, and I took it seriously. But somewhere along the way, that discretion turned into a habit of just not talking about my work at all, even the parts that weren't confidential, even the parts I could have shared freely with you for decades. Your mother used to tell me the same thing, more than once. I should have listened to her sooner." "Dad," he finally said when I'd finished, "I had no idea. Genuinely no idea. I've spent my whole adult life thinking of your career as this vague, boring thing I never needed to understand in detail. And it turns out you're advising sitting governors on decisions that probably affect way more people than anything I do at my marketing job. I feel like an idiot for what I said at that barbecue. You're not an idiot, I said. You're a man who was given incomplete information by his own father for nearly 40 years, and who drew a reasonable conclusion from what he actually had access to. If anything, I owe you an apology for the gap, not the other way around. I still owe you an apology, though, Michael said, for how casually I talked about you in front of my friends. Even with the information I had, I could have described you with more respect than kind of a nobody. That was careless of me, regardless of what I did or didn't know about the specifics. We sat with that for a while, the conversation settling into something quieter and more honest than most conversations Michael and I had managed in years. 2 weeks later, Michael called me with something that genuinely surprised me. He'd mentioned our conversation to Danielle, who had, in turn, done some research on her own about state-level policy consulting and infrastructure funding, largely out of curiosity about what I'd described. She'd apparently become quite interested in the subject and asked if I'd be willing to have a longer conversation with both of them about it sometime, over dinner, without the time pressure of a single evening. That conversation happened the following month, over another dinner, and it turned into something closer to 3 hours of genuine, engaged conversation, with Danielle asking sharp, well-informed questions about funding formula mechanics that told me she'd done real homework beforehand. She'd apparently read through several publicly available policy briefs on rural healthcare funding just to be able to ask better questions, which touched me more than I let on at the table. Michael, for his part, asked if he could sit in on one of my calls sometime, purely as an observer, if that was ever appropriate given the confidential nature of the work. I told him I'd see what I could arrange, with appropriate discretion, and that I appreciated him understanding that not everything could simply be thrown open for casual viewing. A month after that, one of the 3 governors' offices reached out about a piece of legislation moving through committee, and with appropriate permissions in place from that office, I did allow Michael to sit quietly in on part of that call, purely as an observer, seated across the room from my desk, with strict instructions to simply listen. He told me afterward that hearing the actual substance of the conversation, the careful, technical back and forth about how a specific funding mechanism would likely play out across different types of rural districts, the way I pushed back gently on an assumption the governor's staff had made about implementation timelines, gave him an entirely new appreciation for what boring policy stuff actually meant in practice. "Dad," he said afterward, sitting in my kitchen with a cup of coffee going cold in front of him, clearly still processing what he'd heard. That call mattered, like, actually mattered, in a way that affects real people's lives in ways I don't think about in my job most days. I've spent my whole adult life thinking your career was small because you never talked about it, and it turns out it might be one of the more consequential things happening in our family, and I just never knew to ask. Something has genuinely shifted between us since that barbecue. Michael calls more often now, not just for logistics or scheduling, but to ask real questions about my work, about decisions I've been involved in over the decades, about what I actually think about various current policy debates that occasionally surface in the news. He started reading the occasional policy brief himself, sending me articles he finds interesting, asking whether my read on a given issue matches what he's seeing reported. It's a small thing, in some ways, but it represents a kind of curiosity about my life that simply hadn't existed in our relationship for most of his adulthood. At a recent family gathering, a cousin's graduation party, I overheard him telling a different group of friends, with clear and genuine pride this time, roughly the actual shape of what I do, rather than the dismissive shorthand from before. "My dad's actually a pretty big deal in state policy circles," I heard him say, and though he still kept most of the specifics appropriately vague, out of the same respect for confidentiality I'd modeled for him, the tone had changed entirely. No longer an offhand dismissal, but something closer to genuine, if slightly surprised, admiration. Danielle has since asked if I'd be willing to speak, in general terms, to a community group she volunteers with about how state funding decisions actually get made, something that would have been unthinkable to suggest 6 weeks earlier, when the extent of her knowledge about my career was roughly equivalent to Michael's boring policy stuff description. I don't tell you this story because I want sympathy for an old man who overheard an unkind comment through a kitchen window. I tell you this story because I want you to understand something important. The gap between what we actually did with our lives and what our own children understand about it is often a gap we ourselves created, through decades of quiet reticence, professional discretion, or simple assumption that our work wasn't interesting enough to explain in detail. That gap doesn't mean our work didn't matter. It means the story simply never got told, and it's never too late to finally tell it. I spent nearly 40 years being, in my own son's eyes, a vague and slightly boring government consultant. It turns out, 3 sitting governors across 3 different states still call me for advice that shapes real policy affecting millions of people. My son just never knew to ask, because I never thought to tell him, until an overheard comment at a barbecue finally forced the conversation neither of us had known we needed. If this story reminded you of someone in your life whose actual accomplishments you might not fully understand, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and consider asking them the questions you've never gotten around to asking.